Great. So hello, everyone. I'm Aurelio Castro from Italy and University of Bologna. So today I'll talk about how in my research and bisexual activism. So I try to understand and work with stories and bisexualities within our biographies. So don't be fooled. I'm not a full professor. I'm just a postdoc at the university, but I teach some courses and trying to work on a psychosocial approach for studying sexualities. And so what I tried to bring to you today is just a brief positioning of bisexual studies in Italy, which are not many, but and with some key issues, of course, you might already know, and some insights from a qualitative research. So mostly I will just brief you about how I did, at least I tried my best to study bisexualities and orientation as a story, and by asking bi plus people of different genders to tell me about their sexuality when they first understood and they defined themselves as bi plus people and how that intertwined with other different aspects of their identities. So Italy is a interesting context because we actually don't have a national bi plus association. We have a network of small regional association which trying their best, and they manage to coordinate themselves most of the time. We're also a Catholic country, I guess you might already know, and where there's a lot of demonization of gender studies using the conspiracy rhetoric or gender ideology. And we face, as in many other places, major opposition, implicit or explicit, from many monosexual association. We also have some trans-exclusionary national association here, which is kind of complicated as a prospect for non-binary and trans bi plus people. So we kind of understood and historically studied sexual orientation as a usually dichotomous perspective when only two sex and or genders have been understood and inquired through different points. So we know from a lot of good research, and many people actually made that research here. So that sexual orientation is not binary, it's not binary, does not follow just fact, it can actually change environment, and there's flexibility and changes all the time. So we know that bisexual orientation and people always existed. They've always been here, and there's been a huge part of bisexual politics in the LGBTQ and queer movements that actually is hard to find, at least in Italian context, like bisexual books and some major contribution actually arrived just in the last 5 or 6 years, because there's not a lot of English speaking countries. So we have fall quite behind on also bisexual research. There's many good ones, but also on the bisexual activism, which has been pushed away by many monosexual organizations. So there's been a huge part of erasure in bisexual experiences, although we thought in the start of the gay power and the first gay movements in Italy. So we know how, by studying sexual orientation as a bi plus activist, so of course I moved way beyond the binary and tried to understand the different flexibility aspects of orientation, but I was interested in how the multidimensional models and the different components one can inquire through quantitative or qualitative methods, but I was interested in how sexual orientation enters and becomes part of the stories of bi plus people. So I wanted to ask them actually how and when, not in a predatory or delegitimizing way. So they tell me the story and when first they actually started to define and talk about and think about themselves as bi plus, and how that negotiating the identity of being bi plus started and what helped it or what was kind of in the way. So I try to understand the different multiple construction of sexual orientation in their narratives as sexually oriented. Of course, sexual is not just the sexual attraction, there's also the affective and or romantic or the fantasies of many kind of components of sexual orientation by studying the intersection of gender and orientation, but also with different aspects. So we also was really lucky to find some racialized and B plus people of color, and we did also some research on. So we don't only have white people, although we can argue and where Italians position themselves on the line of color. And so we try to I try to understand how these stories actually came to unfold. And since we don't have so much research in Italy, try to build a study to compare with many other international ones. So moving from many kind of theoretical frame, what I wanted to understand is taking a generative approach to the life stories and looking for insights and character developments. So focusing on the meaning, the byproducts of identity negotiation with relevant people in their circle. I interview in the last 3 years as a part also of my PhD project, many bi-plus people, men, women, and non-binary people all across Italy. So most of these interviews have been done online. There's a lot of also non-binary and also trans people. Most of the people who were queer were not religious, and not all of them have a bachelor degree, but most of them. So there's also a bit of understanding of where and what kind of social capital these participants had. They define themselves with many bi-plus identity, mostly as bisexual, many pansexual, or other polysexual and different kinds of B+. These identities were not left unchallenged. Many people were discussing, and we discussed together, how the perceived differences and the actual difference of pansexuality and bisexuality. So many, as many others said in the session of this morning. So like sometimes we actually use, say, bisexual while we actually are pansexual, or we use more than one label to describe ourselves in order to manage expectation and to manage what people expect and can understand about sexuality. So in time, what I asked them to tell their story and when they became and when they understood themselves as bisexual, not just, oh, okay, I use that biological way. I didn't give any prompt about that. I wanted to understand if they constructed sexual orientation as something which could be biological, interpersonal, individual, or some other, or a mixture of this explanation. Trying to see and what kind of construction were used and what were the stories of desire when they first had their attraction to more than one gender, how the partners or family circles, if they were out or not, and how they managed to negotiate their identity and the degree of awareness they put into their relationships, which also most of these people were non-monogamous or polyamorous or relationship anarchists. So there's also the part of relationship agreement and the non-monogamy umbrella to navigate into that. But so I did also a bit of more generative, but also asking them to what actually they did in a more kind of quantitative last part of the interviews. So just to show yourself a bit of fast what I found, or what actually could be useful. So of course, the bi-plus and relationships are in fundamental component of how we signify our relationships and what we do, because it's when we fight the monosexual imperative, when we first have this attraction and we don't know where to go. So bisexual is not a word and identity that's always been available to most people. Some people, of course, navigate through some monosexual idea or pass themselves as gay or lesbian. And as relevant in literature, many people have been also forced or pushed by partners to tell them to describe themselves as gay or lesbian instead of bisexual. And that's the pressure and the biphobic expectation that we can have in monosexual relations or monosexual relationships, or which they appear as monosexual. So when I try to understand what actually were the explanation, there have been many. Some people employed a mixture of biological and individual expectation. Others signify bisexuality as something that comes from the people they met. So from their relationship and from meeting a certain someone that made them or question or made them understand that there are more attraction to one gender, or they can actually feel some more attraction, which can be also widen it to other people and not just a special someone. So we know kind of that sexual fluidity makes us possible to have new attraction and to expand them to other people sometimes, or we can have just that one certain person that we actually really in love or sexually attracted to. But what can I say as a transversal findings is that these bi-plus people find themselves like torn between two words in a country where monosexual identities as gay and lesbian are perceived as essential and something you are born that way and you must be in that way unless you are kind of making your becoming a burden for also LGBT association, but also for your family and friends. So because we kind of are a huge feminist country. And that made for many people, of course, difficult to understand what they could have done with their orientation, when in the same LGBT organization, we never talked about bisexuality. And so most of the bisexual people expect minority stress and tend to avoid L and G association most of the time, because we know that they are not also trained, but even wanting or sometimes prepared to talk about bisexualities because they're seen as invisible and less sexual orientation. As a bi plus man, and we know that bisexual and bi plus men sometimes are kind of believe that we don't exist. And there's been also some really particular bad research trying to explore that bisexuality in men doesn't exist. It's not possible. So I also did a bit of a focus on that and try to see that actually, of course, we don't need psychological, physiological measure to tell us that bisexual men exist or any kind of bi plus an individual exists and their orientation is valid. But and people were kind of aware of that, like the people don't that their relevant ones didn't believe that bisexuality and masculinity could actually intersect, and they had to mentally and physically understand and explore what it meant in as a kind of potential for their relationship and something to explore and experiment for themselves, or as a threat in case of biphobic partners, which like in the case of Stefan and this, I just wrote some small extract, like his partner, who was a bisexual woman, actually accepted her female bisexuality, but he did not accept his male bisexuality because he said that's something really bad thing. So there's different kind of construction and negotiation that we enforce and we enroll when we talk about that. Just to kind of being brief. So with that, I found different kinds of biological and evolutionary explanation of, oh, sorry, there's a phrase in Italian. So from the biological mandate, the heterosexual biological mandate, and the being certain that actually these non-exclusive attraction are biologically rooted. Some people frame and conceptualize their sexual orientation as always there since being pretty young, since being infants, and they always proved and have it to have this attraction, while others is a more interpersonal biographical explanation, like these attractions were not there before, but they came after this event, after meeting this person. They came into my life for this reason. For others, it was more kind of reflexive or a mixture of the two, where by obtaining the language and querying themselves, they managed to challenge the dichotomies and binaries within sexuality. So kind of querying oneself and say, okay, maybe if I'm already non-monogamous, so like for some bi plus people, bi plus who started being first non-monogamous and then challenged their own attraction and started to develop new attraction to new genders. So there's a mix. So what I try to do is trying to understand how we conceptualize our sexual orientation and how that tend to give us some kind of also meaning, but some narrative insights about ourselves and our relationships. Because of course, if our relationship could be monogamous, non-monogamous, we can explain that by following a more biological or a more interpersonal explanation, and how the idea of being sexually oriented to shapes ourselves and our relationship with others. From where does it come from? If it comes from any place, I'm not trying to answer that question because I think it's multidimensional and that's what research is telling us, but we still have a way to signify our orientation from those explanations and see how it goes. So we build our own story of why and how we are and when we are sexually and romantically attracted to other people. So there is a constant fight for your sexuality and bisexuality for any kind of bisexual, not just in Italy, of course, but we also manage to employ different strategies to reduce the stigma. So I think just inquiring sexual orientation more as a process in my research and as a story that brings variability, change, and diversity over time can shed some lights on how bi plus people construct their sexuality and how it became more handful or more useful, providing some kind of narrative discourses more than others, or what to embrace the change and diversity. So the idea that it's not just one story of being bisexual, and as we all know, or being bisexual or any kind of B plus identities, but there's really many different kinds of stories. They're all valid, they're all fine, and then we should focus on how to make bi plus people being good and feel good. Hoping that makes sense. Thank you for listening to me.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reid-Buckley. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Sociology in the University of Limerick in Ireland. Thank you so much for being a part of this session, and thanks so much to the organisers and the chair for such a wonderful event. I'm really honoured to present my research today amongst so many academics and activists who I admire so much. So my presentation today will briefly introduce a prevalent theme in my research, the complex positionality of bi+ people within LGBTI+ contexts. This paper is adapted from my doctoral work, which investigates the lived experiences of bisexualities in post-marriage equality Ireland. For this, I interviewed 34 bi+ people about their experiences of living in the Republic of Ireland, both in wider society as well as in LGBTI+ communities. As I'm sure you're all aware, much empirical evidence has shown the prevalence of bi+ erasure and exclusion within LGBTI+ contexts. My research, however, aims to develop this conversation in the context of bi+ self-exclusion from LGBTI+ communities. So while experiences of inclusion in LGBTI+ contexts were highly varied across my sample, many participants expressed feelings of disconnection. My findings revealed three potential reasons for these feelings: perceived heterosexuality as a barrier, having a lack of necessary experiential narratives, and also having experiences of cultural dissonance. So firstly, I'll just discuss the significance of perceived heterosexuality as a barrier for bi+ inclusion. While many participants who experienced being perceived as heterosexual were in heterosexual presenting relationships, participants who were not partnered felt similarly frustrated at being perceived as straight. Some participants expressed that due to being heterosexual presenting, they feared that they would be perceived by other LGBTI+ people as homophobic or transphobic. However, some participants negotiated a heterosexual identity within LGBTI+ community contexts. For example, the participant quoted above performed her identity as a heterosexual ally when in such spaces. And I found that participants often preempted their exclusion from the space, and as a result, restricted themselves from fully engaging. In the case of this participant, she self-excluded by negotiating her identity in line with how she believed people would perceive her. This is an effective example in demonstrating the intense internalization of exclusion by bi+ people, and it also reveals the assumption that the performance of heterosexual allyship will be more tolerable within the space than the presence of bisexualities. I also found that having a lack of necessary experiential narratives was a significant barrier for participants, and this issue was also linked to perceived heterosexuality. I define necessary experiential narratives as socioculturally significant life stories that contribute to an individual's capacity to be seen as authentic. Some such necessary narratives are coming out stories or having a past queer relationship. While possessing such narratives does not ensure inclusion, not having such experiences or a lack of a willingness to divulge such information can have adverse effects. As was the case with perceived heterosexuality, there was evidence that participants internalized by negative ideas that place bi+ people outside of community contexts. This participant expressed that she had never attended or participated in any LGBTI+ communities due to feelings of anxiety around her lack of experience with same-sex activity, as she was previously married to a cis-het man. This also affected her ability to use queer dating apps, as she worried that she would not be seen as a proper bisexual by other LGBTI+ identifying women. However, some participants did have negative encounters with other LGBTI+ people that deterred them from seeking connection any further. In the above example, this participant recounted a negative experience with a college LGBT society that discouraged her from returning or seeking out any other LGBTI+ spaces in Ireland ever again. As shown in these examples, these ideas are both socially reproduced and individually internalized and maintained. Finally, in my research, I found that cultural dissonance was a significant issue for bi+ participants in finding a connection with LGBTI+ communities. Often participants said that they were dissuaded from participating in LGBTI+ spaces and community contexts due to their own aversions to party culture and/or alcohol-focused events. The above participant had previously attended such spaces and felt like nightclubs and bars were his only available option in finding community. The participant noted that because of the hyper-focus on club culture, he was deterred from seeking out other LGBTI+ community spaces, and he also criticised their lack of representation as well as the availability of sober spaces. Furthermore, several participants from across Ireland tended to have issues with commercialised LGBTI+ spaces and events, referring to them as isolating and uncomfortable. As many participants argued, this was because these contexts were focused heavily on the interests and tastes of cis gay men, and often at the expense of more marginalised LGBTI+ people. Another prevalent aspect which brought about disconnection was the culture of misogyny that was facilitated in some gay spaces. The participant quoted above noted that cis gay men would often make derogatory comments about her in their assumption that she was heterosexual. Overall, these experiences of disconnection highlight convergent matters of limited representation and inclusivity within mainstream LGBTI spaces that are not just bi+ specific, but also compound both structural issues and social problems. From my interpretations, I argue that bi+ individuals' feelings and experiences of disconnection tend to stem from an internalization of authentic or legitimate LGBTI+ subjectivities. As highlighted in these examples, participants who self-excluded themselves from fully engaging with LGBTI+ communities tended to comment on how their experiences and identities did not correspond with those of other non-heterosexual people. However, it must be highlighted that this self-exclusion from LGBTI contexts is not always fixed. From my analysis, I suggest that bi+ inclusion politics operate on a spectrum from ambivalence to advocacy. That is, bi+ individuals' experience of disconnection with LGBTI+ communities can fluctuate throughout their life cycles. Along the spectrum, there is movement from states of indifference to being in LGBTI+ spaces and communities to self-advocating for their own inclusion. In moving across this spectrum, bi+ individuals continuously renegotiate their identities in complex and sometimes contradictory ways, positioning themselves outside, within, and sometimes in between communities. I found that there was 3 key factors which influence individuals' fluctuating positionalities on this spectrum. Space was a significant factor, as urban-rural differences reveal different terms of accessibility to LGBTI+ spaces. For example, participants who moved to a more urban place often noted a positive change in their connectivity due to a wider variety of community contexts. Temporal factors were also significant for participants' sense of connectivity, as some individuals noted that as they grew up, they became more comfortable in their sexual identities. Therefore, they began to accrue greater self-confidence over time, enabling an advocate positionality. However, other participants were affected more negatively over time, as one participant in his 50s noted that the more he participated in LGBTI+ communities, the more he learned not to disclose his bisexuality, and has since not participated in wider LGBTI+ groups. As shown here, sociocultural factors such as encounters with bi-negative attitudes or discourses can affect individuals' feelings of connectivity to LGBTI+ communities. On the other hand, sometimes experiences of bi-negativity actually motivated people to advocate for themselves to be included within these contexts. However, it must be noted at this juncture that positionalities on the spectrum do not always fit into a neat positive-negative binary. Rather, several participants simultaneously included and excluded themselves from LGBTI+ communities. That is, while they agreed that their bisexuality places them within LGBTI+ communities, they did not participate or feel included within these contexts. So before I finish up, I wish to return to my claim that bi+ self-exclusion was due to an internalization of narrow and essentialist ideas of LGBTI+ subjectivities. As I interpreted my interview data, I found that these limited conceptions of LGBTI+ identity often stemmed from direct or hypothetical negative encounters with other LGBTI+ community members. While I do not dispute the validity of bi+ people's experiences and feelings, I argue that it is incorrect to assume that bi+ exclusion is solely a result of LGBTI+ intergroup conflict. Rather, I conclude that bi+ self-exclusion is often due to the prevalence of wider gender and sexual hegemonies, which in turn can create narrow categorizations of individuals and their identities. The result is often a cyclical process of identity definition and a struggle for inclusion by both the self and by others. For many bi+ people who self-excluded themselves, this felt like fighting a losing battle. So to conclude, the work to break the cycle cannot just be done by bi+ individuals ourselves, nor can it only be isolated within LGBTI+ communities. Rather, I argue that collective work is required to break down these structural barriers that exist across all social spheres. So to finish up then, in the words of radical bisexual poet Diane de Prima, no one way works. It will take all of us, shoving at the thing from all sides to bring it down. So thank you very much for listening.
Hello, good afternoon to all, or in my case, good morning. First of all, I just want to say that English is not my first language, as you can probably tell. So if you can't understand what I'm saying, please let me know, and I'll try to speak more slowly, okay? So my name is Helena Monaco. I'm from Brazil. I'm a doctorate student in anthropology at the University of Santa Catarina in Florianópolis. And today I'm going to be talking about my master's research, which took place in 2019. During the research, I explored the actions and political ideals of a bisexual collective from São Paulo, Brazil, which I call the B Collective. And that is not its real name because I wanted to preserve the identity of the participants. So I conducted the research through semi-structured interviews with 12 activists, as well as participant observation in one of the collective's activities and document analysis. So the Brazilian bisexual movement is very young compared to some other countries, particularly those in the global north. And bisexual activists were always present in gay and lesbian movements, of course, but they started to organize as bisexuals in the early 2000s. And it was only in 2010 that we started to see independent bisexual organizations. I mean, in the beginning, there were small bisexual organizations inside larger LGBT movements. And in 2010, some bisexual collectives were created as separate initiatives. And today we have many collectives and even a national organization which unifies some of those collectives and independent activists called Frente Bisexual Brasileira, which means Brazilian Bisexual Front. And the B Collective is one of the oldest and most important Brazilian bisexual collectives to this day. And I wanted to understand their views on bisexuality as a category of political organization and a category of understanding of the self and formation of subjectivities. And I found that the collective acted mainly as a way to create welcoming spaces for bisexual and monodissident people. So monodissidence is a category commonly used in bi+ movements in Brazil, created by an activist and psychologist called Dani Vaz. And it refers to all identities and practices that are dissident from monosexuality, namely bisexuality, pansexuality, and many others. So the goal with this category is to unify the different identities in one political movement, since their demands are often very similar. So monodissidence is not an identity category, but a way to bring together those different identities. And being mental health, one of the biggest issues regarding the bi+ community, the B Collective worked to create safe and welcoming spaces as a way to remedy the profound suffering and feelings of loneliness caused by the constant exclusion of bi and monodissident people from both LGBT and straight spaces. So the collective then created spaces of sociability and solidarity where bisexuality was validated and normalized. One of those was the so-called conversation circles for validation of bisexual experiences, which were mediated by psychologists. And their aim was to break the cycle of suffering specific to the bisexual people's experience due to the constant rejection they face. And they did that by creating a space where bisexual people could meet up and talk about their issues and struggles away from the monosexual gaze. And it is thus a direct action to promote the mental health of bi+ people, since there are few places where specialized psychological support is available for bisexuals. In many cases, health professionals are themselves biphobic, making the situation even worse and bi people more vulnerable. I also found that the research subjects felt safer and more secure of their identities and and of themselves when they found those welcoming spaces. They told me that before finding a bisexual community, they had many doubts about their sexuality and they felt very strange and out of place. But when they found the collective, they also found a community to support and care for them. And it was often through the B collective that people discovered that bisexuality was a real and valid option. So the collective was very important for them to accept their bisexuality and to fight invalidation. So I argue that the creation of those welcoming spaces is itself a form of activism when we are talking about bi+ people, given that it is still very difficult to find bisexual spaces in Brazil. And here the internet is very important too, because many people do not have access to bisexual spaces in person. So online initiatives have been growing in numbers for the past 10 years or so, and the pandemic has accelerated that tendency since last year. So in 2020 and 21, we saw many online events, especially now in September, creating those bisexual spaces. But one of them is the Bi+ Festival promoted online by the Brazilian Bisexual Front, which is a cultural and political festival. Last year, we had the first edition, and this year we have the second one happening later today and tomorrow on YouTube. So I think that caring and welcoming as activism helps with the creation of solidarity bonds and a form of activism based on mutual support. It is a form of independent activism that aims to directly answer the demands of bisexual people, helping those who are struggling with mental health issues and suffering. And I would like to end my talk with a quote from one of the people I interview. And he says, "I think that for any identity, it helps to be in touch with other people that identify like you do. People that help you strengthen your identity. They give you a feeling of comfort. Having those people by your side gives you a feeling of belonging. And I think that is one of the most important things, feeling that you belong where you are." Thank you very much.